everybody, and welcome to episode 7 of the On the Couch podcast, where we talk about Couchform and all the ideas behind it.
Woo!
Woo indeed. Hell yeah.
Yeah.
So today, before we get into the topic of today, we're going to do the brief introduction thing again. See if we can find new ways to do that.
Yes, hello. We've done this so many times. Hi, I'm Silent. I do roleplay stuff in VR occasionally. I joined the VR roleplay community around 3 years ago. Have participated in a number of roleplays since then. Have dabbled in running my own roleplays, and now we're here on the couch with a fresh, hot, new roleplay. I don't know what to call this. Style.
Yeah. School of
Style.
thought.
Yeah.
I've been juggling between style and school of thought, depending on how pretentious I want to sound, you know?
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, and
that's good.
we're sitting here by this pool with the little this little frog thingy looking over the pool, just a little bit of scenery. We're gonna talk about immersion, so what better to talk about immersion than a nice pool. But anyways, my introduction. God, hi, I'm Solus. I don't roleplay anymore. Basically, it's been months. I've been looking for that angle back in, but dear God, has it been something? So I've been roleplaying for a bit over 4 years in VR. Mostly got my foray into roleplaying when I actually got into VR. So something that I kind of built into as I popped into my new social outlet as soon as the pandemic started to get into full swing. It was basically like peak of the self isolation. So got the VR headset, learned about VR roleplay. Haven't really looked back since. Been a big part of my life, and big passion behind theorizing about it, thinking about it, what makes it better, and what we're doing here today, talking about it, and having these sort of critical discussions about what roleplay looks like and how we can work with it and do interesting things with it, especially with VR. Carlon says cannonball.
Mm-hmm.
Go for it. Go ahead, dude.
Oh, shoot. I don't have legs.
You you just gotta kind of curl up.
I would if I could.
Bring your arms in, kind of like you got half of it. You could the rest you can leave to imagination.
But then we won't be immersed.
A cannonball doesn't have legs either. If you really want to be the cannonball, legs aren't required.
See, if we do theater of the mind, we won't be immersed though. Okay. You know what? I'll do some I'll do some talk RP here. I get up out of the couch and
Okay.
I walk towards the pool.
Okay.
And I jump and I curl up into a ball and there's a big splash.
Okay. I disabled the visibility on your stream avatar to show that you are now in the pool and not on the couch.
Thank you.
All right, get back up here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so you want to be the cannonball. It's not about the splash. It's about the intent behind the splash. So true, Curlon. So true. So it's about the thought. It's the thought behind it that matters, right? Full immersion. Okay, so we talked about immersion a little jokingly there, but to get to the actual meat of the topic here, we're talking about is diegesis, and the principle specifically being maximize diegesis. So we gotta talk about what that means, because it's a really funky word, right? So let's talk about that, right? What is diegesis? What does that even mean? Do you want to You want to pitch a definition, Dylan?
Sure. So diegesis is usually a word that's used kind of in the context of stories. Um, and diegesis is essentially talking about the things that are part of the world of the story. So anything that is inside the world of the story um, is part of the diegesis, and anything that is not part of the world of the story is not part of the diegesis. You can also say diegetic versus not diegetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it says a word that's used. That's so true. But yeah, the kind of the distinction there is like in world versus out of world, right? One thing I've learned somewhat recently is that the word's kind of also used in the context of game audio, and in that context, basically spatial audio is determined to be diegetic audio because you can hear its directionality in the world, and because of that, it exists within the world. So as you are navigating around as your character, you are hearing the source of the audio as it is in the world rather than hearing it the same no matter where you are. And this is what they call diegetic audio. So when we use a term, we are, as Dylan said, seeing this as a notion of in versus out of world. And when it comes to roleplay, that is a very strong distinction that we make, right? But
It's and we're talking about stories, and well, wouldn't you know it? What are we doing in roleplay but telling stories?
exactly. And so all of
We have a
this,
story.
go on.
We have a story, and we have a world for that story. And so anything that's on the inside is going to be considered diegetic, and anything that's not on the inside is going to be not diegetic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we'll at some point talk about the dividing line between
Yeah,
those two things, but yeah.
absolutely. So I guess one thing to kind of expand on is like the practicality of this, right? Like, how does this relate to what we already do? One thing that I like to look at immediately is, and this is why why we chose the wording of this principle as it is because diegesis is almost always a selection, right? You have different ways to portray the thing that you want to do, whether you're a player trying to react to or describe something that isn't seen, whether you are a GM trying to create some sort of feeling or emotion within a scene or some sort of visual effect, but may or may not have the tools to do so because practically speaking, it's impossible to portray literally everything because you can never plan for everything. There are options that are considered in these circumstances that you have to think. Do I have the opportunity to create this thing in the exact way that I want to? And if not, how do I make that real in the context of this experience? So, one such option that we might consider when we're looking at something like unseen items is describing them. And this is where my brain goes when I think of the option selection, right? I have some sort of object and I'm trying to describe it to the other person. How do I do that? Do I tell them what it is as myself, the player? Or is there a way to tell them as my character? And oftentimes, the latter is very possible and also basically always a better choice if you value the immersion that you have within that experience, which most people do. You're in a role play. You're playing your character. You want to feel immersed into the environment as a character. It's kind of the big value of being able to do all these different things in VR, right? That the option then, instead of you as a player saying, I have in my hand a flower with red petals, but a strangely blue stem, and it glows, especially in the night. You can see it from 100 yards away or something like that. When in reality, I could be, as a character, saying something like, look at this flower. Uh, these red petals may be somewhat common, but this stem, don't you think it glows quite nicely? I mean, I quite saw it from across the town. Right? That alone means that you have options selected to be more in character, and that's kind of what we're looking at when it comes to this principle. Is like recognizing those moments where you can select that option and figuring out how to do that. So like that then comes the question of how do we do that?
So I suppose to summarize, right? I guess that was a example of non-diegesis, but to summarize, right? Essentially, right, different role plays have different goals, but immersion is like a really common goal amongst role plays, right? It's certainly not like a universal goal, but it's a really common goal. And more so, it is immersion is for us over here with Couchform, right? Is a pretty big goal, right? Like part of the reason that we the two of us here like to role play is because, right, we want to kind of tell these stories and experience what it's like to be someone else in a different or strange world, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are many reasons that a person would role play, right? And immersion is one of those reasons. So when we say, right, like when we say maximize diegesis, that is one means of kind of maintaining immersion. So to say maximize diegesis, that means that, when you can, right, if possible, we want to do things inside the world of the story rather than remind ourselves about real life, which is outside the world of the story, if possible. And there is a big, there's a really, really, really big asterisk that comes attached to that if possible, right? There's going to be like a huge, huge, huge asterisk there. When is it possible? When is it not possible, right? Which I suppose we should probably eventually talk about today. But in general, it is as far as Couchform is concerned, it is a goal, right? It is an explicit goal for us to do our best to bring things that we can into the world of the story, because this will help us, right? Maximizing diegesis will help us maximize immersion.
Mm-hmm. And I guess to like really harken on stuff that we said in the past too, all of this kind of thematic understanding and thematic building of characters, in a lot of ways, helps us really draw into the mindset of the characters that we play within these settings, which then informs that, like, yeah, absolutely, we really do want to play into this high level of immersion that we want to experience within these role plays that Couchform is aiming for, because that is exactly how we attain that sort of clarity of understanding, is that we're kind of immersing into this thematic basis. It's a bit circular, but that's kind of the way I see it. And this also does bring up a really kind of fundamental point too. There's a really classical understanding of role plays. What was the name of it? Is a three-way diagram? The immersionist, dramatist, and simulationist.
I think so, but honestly I don't remember because like I think like I split it into four ways, but it doesn't matter.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. We don't have to argue about it. It was I don't remember what it's called. I think you're right.
Three-way
I think it
model,
is like threefold, or like threefold model, three-way. I don't remember,
something like that.
but essentially you split kind of the desires or goals of role players into three categories. You have the narrativist slash dramatists, which I personally divide, but I don't think the model. Actually, let's not make stuff up right here. Threefold model. Um, okay, the threefold model actually. Oh, sorry, no. The threefold model wasn't the one that was separating players. That was separating goals. Right.
Mm.
So the other models represent or separated players. The threefold model specifically separated goals into drama, game, and simulation. So I think that's actually not the one we're referring to. We were thinking of the GNS theory, which splits things into gamism, narrativism, and simulationism.
Hmm.
I believe that's what we're thinking about.
Yeah, that's definitely the one. So, me thinking into that model, um, all of our kind of past podcast episodes have built up on this dramatist angle, this necessary amount of structure to orchestrate this level of like consistent thematic drama that we're seeking to push in these role plays. And then what we're doing here with this principle is we're essentially filling in the rest with the immersionism, right? Am I losing my mind? Is narrativism, simulationism, and gameism? You know?
So honestly, there are just like a bunch of a bunch of silly stuff, and there are like
Yeah.
multiple models. Different people disagree. Um, you know what? I'm not going to talk about any of like the established models. I'm just going to talk about what I think because I don't know.
That's a good idea.
I'm on
Yeah.
this podcast. Uh, yeah. So there's like lots of fascinating roleplay theories, and people have been back and forth over like what is important, what isn't important. Um, I've taken my stab at separating these things as well, and you know, I I was like looking at the threefold model, and I'm like, but what if there was a fourth fold, right? And and kind of the idea being that what do people want out of a role play, right? What are the things that people want in a role play? Um, and I think at some point, right, like categorizing becomes a bit silly, but I have
Mm.
decided to split it into uh kind of immersion. That's the kind of immersion being number one. Then you have narrative, and you have drama, and I guess progression, which I kind of split into the kind of immersionist, narrativist, dramatist, gamist,
Okay.
not in any particular order. Um, but yeah, the idea is that what do people want out of role plays? Well, immersion, right? Being the experience of being transported to another world and playing a character and being in someone else's shoes is something that is kind of a really big reason that people roleplay. And different schools of roleplay, right? Different kind of styles of roleplay are going to prioritize different aspects here, right? Um, I don't think there's a wrong answer. Like, I don't think there's a wrong answer. I think the only wrong answer is if you like prioritize one thing so much that like you basically get rid of the other aspects, right? I think I've personally seen it go too far in every direction. But I do think that as far as us over here on Couchform, I think we do appreciate our uh, immersion and our diegesis. Though
Mhm.
full disclosure, I myself I would consider myself a dramatist. I will sacrifice my immersion on occasion for spicier scenes.
Mhm. Though that's like definitely a larger goal with what we've built here, right? Is we do absolutely encourage looking for those kind of embrace conflict sort of moments, right? Where we
Mm,
can have those spicier scenes because we're pushing a dramatic angle more so than just being the character. Because being the character and just doing what the character wants to do 100% of the time, it can get very boring. Because if a character is a person, a reasonable thinking person doesn't push conflicts. They live out their life. They generally avoid getting into major issues and generally try to be as amicable as possible within reason. Right? That's the
mm,
standard reasonable person angle,
mm.
which
Yeah,
is
and
not fun for stories.
yeah, and this is where that that huge asterisk comes in, right? Um, and I'll bring this back up probably multiple times today. But this is kind of where that comes in. Um, I think like there is room for different people who want different things in the same role play, right? And I think there are plenty of ways to like you know be a dramatist or be a gamist or be whatever other thing that you personally are prioritizing. Um, it's not a zero sum game, right? And roleplay is
Mm-hmm.
not a zero sum game. Um, there are ways to do things that don't come at the detriment of other things, right? There are certainly going to be ways to like prioritize the intensity of a scene that doesn't come at the cost of immersion,
Mm-hmm.
or at the very least doesn't come at the cost of other people's immersion. Maybe you are perfectly fine giving up your own immersion. Um, but when we say maximize diegesis, um, what that's really saying is to kind of like on a structural level, so kind of from the organizer's perspective, right? From the perspective of like who's running the role play, not necessarily from the individual player perspective, but from the structural perspective, maximize the level of diegesis that people are experiencing, because
Mm-hmm.
that can only be good for everybody, right? That can only be good for everybody, even if somebody themselves doesn't value um, that diegesis or that immersion as highly as other people. Um, I guess that's what the asterisk is for. If you can bring something into the story, right, and like there isn't really like a huge cost of doing it, well, you should. You absolutely should bring it into the story. There's um, especially if it's not going to like hurt anything else. Um, if you can bring something into the diegesis, you should bring it into the diegesis.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what we're saying.
Right. And this canon should, in my own experience, generally stands right across from the alternative option, which is usually to say it, to talk about it, right? Within the context of the scene, we call this narrating, right? If usually a GM will do this in place of representing the thing, which obviously there's a question of like practicality and whether or not it's even possible to do that. But generally, like the alternative situation looks like, GM floats over to you and describes what you see in a scene, right? Or
Yeah,
what you
well,
feel.
I mean, I think I think that's a good point, and I think that's the fact that it's usually talking is probably a specific aspect of VR roleplay. If you think about it, what are the ways that real life intrudes into VR roleplay? Um, well, there's the fact that you have a headset on and you're like you have controllers in your hands and all that. Um, well, that's a requirement to do VR roleplay. Otherwise, it wouldn't be VR roleplay, right? So
Hmm.
like there's obviously going to be the constant reminder that you're in VR. You can do your best to like forget that you have a headset on your head, but you still have the headset on your head, right? There's we're not quite that far into the future yet, so um, it's VR roleplay, and for the time being, we have no other options, right? The real world will push its way into our role plays at least a little bit, no matter what. We there's no equivalent of the LARP term like 360 LARP for VR role play, simply because well, once again you have a headset on your head, so you can't make literally everything part of the diegesis. But personally, in my opinion, that's fine, right? Like we're not saying everything has to be diegetic, right? We're just saying do your best.
Hmm.
Um, and then the second thing, right? Like the other place that things like might intrude into it is, well, if you were doing some like LARP in real life, right? You would have to like be concerned about your location, but in VR, well, especially if you are making your world yourself, right? If you're not making your 3D space yourself, then you might have some issues with diegesis. I don't know. You're in VR chat and you have just a random floating mirror or some like portals in the world that you're using. That might intrude into the diegesis. But technically, right? Like you can make your own worlds, and when you do, right, there's nothing stopping you from making just every inch of your game world diegetic, if you so wished. Um, if you so wished, right? So you generally don't have real life kind of intruding into your designed game worlds as often, in my experience. So what's left? Well, you have the people who are in the role play, right? So if the people who are in the role play are behaving in a way that's not diegetic, narrating in this case, well, that is something that can absolutely intrude into the diegesis of a role play. Um, so that's I think part of the reason why we usually see um, like narration is kind of like the standout example, because the other forms that the other ways that you might break diegesis are kind of like not applicable in VR roleplay most of the time, I guess.
Hmm. It's the most controllable aspect, right? Because that's like the individual level, and that can absolutely, like, this is something that we would even recommend is like when you are considering explaining or narrating something in an out of character context, like, think about it. Like, what am I required to narrate it this way? And is there a way to do it otherwise? The example I kind of gave earlier is like hopefully a good enough example to showcase a lot of things don't really have to be narrated, right? If you are standing atop, if you're a GM watching players stood atop a mountain, and you want to portray that it's cold, instead of telling them that it's cold, you can make some like noises of like a breeze blowing at the top of the mountain, and that would immediately inform that the necessary detail here for them to understand is that the wind is blowing, which means it's likely chilly, which means that it's cold, and then they can react that it's cold, and then suddenly it's cold. That's part of the truth.
You can just make it really snowy looking, and then leave it up to each player's interpretation as to whether or not they are cold. Obviously, in this case, this is, I guess, the actual cold itself will not be part of the diegesis because, well, we, our VR headset is not going to be able to simulate the snow, or the feeling of the snow blowing around us. But at the very least, there's no reason to introduce an extra non-diegetic element in the form of narration when a simple visual would do.
I think the next step in the advancement of VR roleplay is for us to hook into air conditioning systems, right? If it needs to be cold, if it's wintertime in your roleplay, bring the temperature down to 60 Fahrenheit.
Caroline says, for this RP, we require participants to find a grocer with a walk-in freezer large enough for a proper play space. Yeah.
All right, now we're getting real into simulationism. Let's go. Yeah, and then they have to be able to exit that and then immediately find the.
Quite honestly, I still don't know what I still don't understand what simulationism means. Full disclosure.
I mean, it's like it's just closer to 1-to-1, right? I guess like
I've thought that in the past and then been told that that's not the case. So anyway, but it's just confusing. I don't know. There are lots of definitions. There are lots of competing definitions. I don't think it's terribly important though.
I would think like actually I want to comment on that. I feel like the big difference is experience versus activity, because the sorry, activity is not the best word here. In versus out of character experience. So I would in the form of like immersionism, I would label that as what happens in the roleplay and what experiences happen in the roleplay. And then for simulationism, I would define that as how you as the player experience the things that happen in the roleplay. How close is it 1-to-1 to your expectation of what you want to experience as the roleplay and actually doing the things versus the 1-to-1-ness of the setting itself and the character being involved in it instead. It's a very thin line, but the two at the very extremes probably look very similar. But that's I think where I would draw the distinction.
I suppose I don't have too much to add. I usually do define the terms myself. I've kind of strayed away from using simulationism on my end because I find it confusing. But yeah, I mean, I suppose whatever you define the terms to be. As always. Whew.
As always.
All right. I mean, I think we have a decent like basis for kind of the to answer the question of like what is diegesis, right?
Yeah,
I think we've
definitely. So
oh, good.
I was gonna do the segue. You want to do the segue?
You know what? Sure. All right. So okay. Now that we know what diegesis is, right? We know what diegesis is. We know why we want to maximize it, right? It's just a thing that people, I suppose, especially us, value in roleplay. So we know what diegesis is. We know why we want to maximize it. There's a question of, well, how do you actually maximize it? Like, what can you do? How can you maximize diegesis? What are ways to do that? And I think like you'll kind of have like two broad categories here. two really broad categories of like, category 1 being making things diegetic, category 2 being not making things that are not diegetic, right? Which so you want to things that kind of have to be in your game, you want to bring those into your world. But then also, right, if things that don't have to be in your game, you really want to consider, right, if it's like if you have a non-diegetic element that's not in your game, sorry, if you have non-diegetic element that doesn't need to be in your game, then you can think of ways to remove that element, and that will also help raise your level of diegesis.
So let's look at the first option then, and I can kind of expand on where I'd like to start for this is ways to make things more diegetic. This I find ties in really strongly with the strength of the VR medium. Is that because we have the ability to make anything, there tends to be there tends to be, how do I word this? So I don't want to make it seem like a crutch, because it's like it gives us more freedom to like explore different kinds of roleplay than we would otherwise in real life, right? And different kinds of diegesis. Like we can make whatever kinds of models we want that are either work differently than regular people or have certain effects or whatever. And adding these sort of elements in helps us add diegetic elements. Making a fireball appear out of thin air is not something we can do in real life. But having this particle effect plus a little noise, both being two very separate considerations, but also very important, add diegetic elements. Thinking of the world, right? If there is if you know there's supposed to be a table in a room, you can just add the table. You can just manifest it out of thin air if you wanted to. You can create a system where you can do that in real time if you wanted to. Those are ways to add diegetic elements, and that's like really breaking it down from the very foundational perspective of we do have so much freedom to create diegetic elements in ways that like no other medium can do, right? Looking at like other types of roleplay, you have IRL LARP that has a very strong limitation on what we're able to portray because real life limitations. You have other role plays that exist in other sorts of game mediums, like role playing games, that are limited by the engine and the capabilities of the game itself. You have kind of text roleplay or tabletop roleplays that are usually limited by once again IRL components, but also like usually are not free real time because you have these limitations of like systems and how you can actually interact within the space, because it's kind of like a separated space, right? You are at the table, the space is somewhere else, you're not in it. So once again, the immersive capacity comes in with the fact that we are completely immersed in our characters in the sense of literally being them, right? When we put on that headset, we are looking out of the eyes of our character. We bring up our hands, and the equivalent of the hand of our model, if it has one, will also be there. We are literally the characters in that circumstance. But like, once again, this extreme strength of the VR medium is that we can have so much more freedom to create diegetic elements. Does that mean that we're necessarily completely the strongest diegetic medium possible? No, because as Sylvan said before, we have the limitations of literally being in VR and those elements coming in to kind of haunt us, right? If your hand starts losing tracking, that's like the immediate reminder, right? For example, it's just a limitation of like, it's still not you. So you can't be
It's
100% immersed.
I think it's very much like a depth versus breadth thing here,
Yeah, yeah.
where like if you think about like real life LARPs, I've mentioned a term like 360 LARP, which is kind of the concept where you go to a place and specifically nothing like when they say 360, they mean it. Everything is everything in the game space is part of the game world, and there is nothing that's not part of the game world. You'll have like costume requirements. You'll have to leave your like you have to leave your cell phones behind. You'll have to like you know, everything in the play space is going to be part of the game world in a 360 LARP. So that's like probably the highest level of diegesis that you could possibly attain, right? Um, however, real life is well saddled with the problem of it being real life. So anything that doesn't exist in real life doesn't exist, right? Um, and so even though you can make this perfectly diegetic space because everything is literally real in your in your like inside your magic circle, even though you can do that, you're kind of limited in the topics you can do, right? Like I guess back to kind of characters and costumes. Let's say you want to role play something that is not human in a real life LARP. Well, first things first, it's in certain situations it's possible, but good luck. Good luck making it like truly diegetic. Um, good luck doing it in a way that you don't have to remind yourself that you have like prosthetics or whatever. I know some people can do it, but even the people who can do it are usually going to be limited to things that are humanoid. And if you're wanting to do something that's specifically not humanoid, well, then really good luck, right? Like you're going to have to do some crazy stuff, and probably the crazy stuff that you're going to end up doing is going to remind you that you're like piloting a puppet rather than being your character at that point, right?
Mm.
VR, we're always going to have that headset on our head. We're going to always have a constant reminder that we are in real life. There's no escape from it. So there's no way to make a VR role play as of this time that is 100% diegetic or 100% immersive, right? But you can get pretty close, right? You can get pretty close, and in addition to getting pretty close, you can play a creature that has you know 4 arms and 1 leg, right? Or you can cast a fireball and have it like actually appear in front of you, or you can be in outer space and not like actually in space and not just on in the interior of like some hallways that you say is a spaceship, right? um so VR is inherently, as of this time, not 100% immersive, but what you gain in giving up that bit of immersion is scope, right? You get a breadth. You can bring more things. There are more things that you can bring into the game world that you could not in real life.
Yeah, it's like I'm surprised this conversation doesn't happen more often. Just talking about like how much more we can do in VR, because God, there's very few limits on like what we can do besides like performance, right? Like we have to make sure the people's machines perform well enough to actually do the thing that we want. But besides that, like the VR chat medium specifically has like so much customizability on what you can create and how it works. You can fiddle with physics. You can ride vehicles and not be in danger depending on the environment, as opposed to like real life and concerns with that potentially. There's just so much you can fly. All right, you can fly. That's pretty cool, right? There's just so much you can do.
Oh, yeah, I've had a lot of fun playing a flying character. That was great.
Yeah. I remember flying one of the vehicles in Neon Divide, and dear God, it makes sense, but God, it definitely informs me that I would not be a good pilot, because A, it's hard, and B, it is like super disorienting. But the fact that it exists is pretty crazy, right? It's so crazy. It's flying an ND, yeah. But it is one of those points of like, these are things to think about when you're thinking about adding diegetic elements. Like you might kind of first have the idea of, I want to do this thing. I want to show or do or represent XYZ. And then the next thought ends up being like, well, how do I make that happen? And in a lot of cases, it is actually very doable. But if it's not like directly, if it's not perfectly doable, like you can't have your 1,000-man army, how do you do that? Right?
Yeah,
There's
I guess that I
asterisks.
guess that I guess that's a good question, right? And here's the way I'll phrase it. I'll actually I'm sorry, I'll throw this back at you, Solace.
Sure.
I was thinking of a way of phrasing the question. Um, because this is what we were talking about right now is like the high end of VR roleplay, right? We have infinite budget, infinite time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we can in that case, right, we can bring almost everything, right? Almost everything into our world. And, like pretty much anything we want aside from, the minor inconveniences of technology, right? Which are going to be ever present. We can't solve those, but anything that you could imagine, any type of story that you could want to tell, if you had infinite budget and infinite time, you can bring it into your game world. Now, here's the thing, we don't have infinite budget, we don't have infinite time. You want to like do this like really you want to do these like really cool things, but you feel like you can't, right? You can't do all of it. You can't have the cool space flying, and the amazing avatars and the 1,000-man army all at the same time. um what do we do, right? What do we do in that scenario, right? Where like I've just written a role play and I've kind of have all these elements in it, right? And I've written this role play and I have all these elements in it, and I'm like trying to bring all of them into my world. What do I do in that situation?
The one word I could think about that best sums up my answer is representation. So representing something using abstraction, and that's a topic we'll talk about next week. Using abstraction to really to create a representation of the thing that isn't exactly the thing. You don't necessarily need the one to one every single time, but at least something to represent it in the circumstance that you expect to be in. Like, for example, if you want to simulate that 1,000-person army, and it's a 1,000-person battalion that's at war with you on your spaceship, having a bunch of lasers flying around the sky that you can see through the windows simulates that, right? You don't need the 1,000 players to be in their spaceships flying around firing those lasers. You just need the lasers, because realistically, there is a limit to how much someone can perceive, and representation in kind of like filling up that kind of perceptive area as much as possible is a really strong consideration to have when you're thinking about representing big things like that. If you want to represent your flying on a player level, that becomes a lot tougher. Um, I'm actually not sure how I would approach an alternative to that. I
I
don't
think
remember what the
I'll
third example was.
I think I'll probably like kind of say the same thing in a different way, right?
Sure.
Um, and though I think what you're getting at here is kind of like a way to combat scope creep. I'll put it that way, because I think that the situation that we've been describing of like wow, we're in VR, we can pull everything into our game, right? It's really tempting to then just add stuff to your role play, right? Add. Um, that's not adding more stuff doesn't make your game more diegetic, right? Having more diegetic elements doesn't necessarily make your game more diegetic. Having non-diegetic elements, right, will make your game less diegetic, but but like adding more things that are diegetic will just keep it right at the same level, which is your role plays diegetic. So so in this context, right, like this is kind of like um this is kind of like the catch here, right? Is that I was phrasing it intentionally, maybe as somewhat of a trick question, right? Where it's like the way I would solve this problem is by kind of stepping back for a moment and like consider, go all the way back to the themes, right? Consider what is it that I actually trying to do here? What are my themes? Why do I have these things in my role play? What's important, right? What's important to me? Um, there are going to be like some there are going to be like some levels of stuff, right? Do I really need to put in the dev time to create a immersive like spacewalk simulator where you can fly around with like a jetpack? Does that add to my themes? Or perhaps would a window kind of like overlooking the planet below um, be enough to bring that fact into my world that we are in space? Um, and like in this context, right, it's really going to be a combination of like really considering what is it that I actually want, what is it that I actually need to for this role play. If you have the resources, by all means add more stuff, go for it, right? Like I want to see really cool VR role plays. But this is also like from a practical and logistical perspective, right? We don't have infinite time, we don't have infinite resources. So consider what is it that is the most important, right? What is it that will what are those things that will not only be diegetic but will best reflect the themes of your roleplay, right? Because that's what you really want to add. You want to add things that reflect your themes and are diegetic, right? Not just things, right? You don't just want to add things.
Yeah, I'm gonna
And
go ahead.
I suppose I'm almost done. And if you do have these things, right? If you do have all these really cool ideas, I think Solus, your suggestion is really good. Where instead of just being like, okay, well, I guess we have to throw that idea completely away, right? It can be a useful exercise to think about, well, is this thing that I was trying to add, is this what I really wanted to add? Or perhaps did I just like want, right? Do I really need the thousand players, right? The 1,000 players flying in spaceship? Or perhaps is what I actually wanted kind of a feeling of like being overwhelmed. Um, perhaps the thing that I actually wanted can be added in a different way that's more you know more realistic with your limited resources.
Right. And I'll voice my disagreement very quickly before I get to the
Go
supporting
ahead.
part. That there was a point where you said that like adding more diegesis and like the okay. Let me two things now that I think about it.
Here we
So
go. That's the
so
controversial statement of the day. There you go.
so
Go
the
ahead.
scope creep bit, I don't necessarily believe that it's like, I mean the way that you worded kind of the response is very much like putting scope creep as the like the main contributing factor of like why we make those considerations, and I don't think that's true. I think that generally speaking, I don't think it is necessary to see the scope as a problem at that point. I think experimenting with scope is definitely good. I think that it should be one of the first things that people do with VR, with it being such a high freedom sort of space, and that like test out some ideas, like see what works. Uh,
Mhm.
but to round out that very important point, consider what's most important when you're doing that, which is basically
Mhm.
what you said, right? Like see what themes you're going for and what actually like supports that. So if you do have like say some sort of role play, if you are on your spaceship and your spaceship is about like interpolitical strife or whatever, and then you think about like adding that spacewalking, like what does that actually accomplish for your role play? Like what is it actually offering to help your players thematically experience that like interpolitical sort of theming in your role play? And generally speaking, I wouldn't see much of a reason for it. So I would think, oh, maybe I don't need that. And then at that point, it's still not yet scope creep because you haven't quite gotten to that point where it's just too much yet.
Mhm.
So it is just like feeling it out.
I
Um,
suppose I can. I suppose I can clarify. Like, I fully 100% agree, and I think I
okay.
missed the thing. I was saying that, like, adding more stuff isn't necessarily beneficial, but I also think adding more stuff isn't necessarily detrimental until you hit that point where you overwhelm yourself, right?
Yeah.
The moment you hit that point where like you can no longer create the role play because you just have too much, right? That's when scope creep is an issue, right? It's not an
Hmm.
issue until you hit that point of, well, we can't do the thing anymore. Um,
Yeah.
but of course, I suppose that's I guess a thing that lots of designers run into is like usually it's a lot easier to just like add more and more and more and more ideas than it is to reject them because the ideas are cool.
Right.
Um, but yeah, no, I completely agree. It's absolutely add more if you think you can handle it, or probably more precisely, if you know you can handle it. Absolutely add cool things, crazy things, whatever you want. Even if it's not necessarily, you know 100% thematic, right? Experimentation is great. Just make sure that you got the things that you need to do first, and then
Hmm.
add the cherries on top.
Yeah. Yeah. The second bit that I had was the point of like adding diegetics at some point doesn't have really any benefit. Uh, that part I also disagree with. It's like thinking of the example of a combat scenario where someone throws on the combat ambiance track while they're doing their thing, uh, to once again kind of push that simulation angle of or a representation angle of like there's a lot more going on apart from what I'm doing here, and that's like further diegetic elements, right? But that like it shapes the experience, so to speak, right? You're going from having your focused 10 to 20 person encounter versus like being a small part of a much larger conflict. And if you are pushing toward these themes of like the chaos of war, uh, or the unpredictability of these sort of scenario situations, then like having that sort of like ever present ambiance around you of things are still going on out there. It's also chaotic over there. It is definitely going to support that, uh, right? And it's gonna do it in a way that makes you feel more immersed into the setting. So like having that not just be like something you play for yourself, which a lot of people do that with music. That's kind of a very common thing, especially for people that stream roleplay. Uh, but like having that be a part of your world itself would be a consideration as well, right? Like if you do intend to have these sort of big, uh, these big kind of warlike scenarios, think, all right, well, how do I make people feel like they're in a big war? Audio is so useful. We have literally two senses in VR. We have sight and we have hearing. So audio is literally half of the experience. The fact that we don't have ambient audio in so many of these maps that represent the world is wild. I think that should always be one of the first considerations. That was I'm very passionate
I
about audio. I think it's extremely important.
need to wait on a publicly available audio system.
Yeah, we generally just need like better audio systems for VR chat, just generally, right? Isn't there like isn't there so many issues with working with audio to begin with?
I mean, stuff exists. To my knowledge, none of it is like truly publicly available, or like none of it is like really convenient, or the convenient stuff rather is not publicly available. Is the way I'll put it.
Hmm.
Also, you know what? You've actually convinced me. I concede my point. I think
Cool.
this is my dramatist bias showing here a little bit. But yeah, no, I think you're correct. I retract saying that adding more stuff it doesn't make doesn't make it more immersive. I'll retract that. I think
Cool.
at some point you still end up with like diminishing returns probably,
Yes,
but
absolutely.
I retract. I retract the absolute claim. Uh,
Yeah, I had the diminishing returns point in my head that I didn't actually say, but yes, that's exactly what I would replace it with. It is
yeah, yeah, yeah.
not necessarily no gain, but limited gain, and it's like there's a
Hmm.
point of inflection there where it's like you're just putting in a lot more effort than you're actually getting out of it for sure.
Yeah. Like once you
100%.
have, I suppose, once you have a base covered, right? Like once you've evidenced the thing, evidencing it again has like super diminishing returns, right? Or like evidencing the same thing again, you
Mm.
know? Um, is I think the idea, and that's probably more accurate than saying that it has no benefit.
Mm. All right, cool. So that's how to do diegesis, right? How to like add more diegetic elements. Thinking of like ways to do that and what kind of things we add and how much freedom we do have in VR. Uh, this one feels like it's a bit broader, but can be addressed in ways that we already have, and further is how not to do non-diegetic. Wow, words are very hard today. How not to do non-diegetic things. That word's hard. That diegetic is a hard word.
It is. It is.
So like, well, let's talk about that. Like, what are some like non-diegetic things that tend to happen in roleplay, and how do we prevent them?
I mean, there's the elephant in the room. We've already mentioned it, right? Narration,
Hmm.
talk RP, whatever or whatever you want to call it. Right? Whenever this is a really common thing that I've seen in VR roleplay, both on the player end and also on the GM end, where it's like you have something that you want to have in your scene, but it's just not there. It's not in the game world. You don't have a prop. You don't have it on your avatar. So you just like tell the other person what happens.
Yeah, actually,
And
go on.
it's really easy, right? It's really easy to just tell the other person, I have I have a book in my hands, right? So it's really easy, really fast. Um, so like on an effort level, right? On an effort level, I see why people do it, right? Because it's a whole lot easier to just say I'm holding a book than it is to like exit the game, go into Unity, find the book asset, and put it on your avatar, right?
Hmm.
But now, right now you've exited character, and well, that kind of reminds us, right, that we are role playing and not living our life as this character, right? So you
Right.
have introduced a non-diegetic element into your role play in the form of now we have to figure out if you're speaking in character or not in character, right?
Right. And I guess like one thing that can help with that is like differentiating accents, right? If you have a really strong accent as a character, like it's makes it a bit easier to tell that difference. But even then, like the damages that are done there is a you're losing immersion, and your scene partner is losing immersion uh, in that process, and then b you actually kind of lose some of the roleplay too because those kind of narrations pause the roleplay. They stop the roleplay from happening while the explanation is happening because that has to be processed. So when you do kind of exit character to recognize the thing that's happening in character, what you're really doing is like removing the role play a little bit to then add that detail and then get back into it. Which then brings me to the point of, well, okay, there are the two options. So these are the two extremes, I think, of like you could add the book with all the details that you need to show, and then have it on your model preemptively to then introduce, or in the world preemptively to then introduce into the roleplay physically to show one to one exactly what it is. And the other side is you just say what it is, describe as much as possible out of character, so it is as clear as possible to the player because you're speaking player to player, but then you lose some of that immersion. What's in between there, right? One thing that I talked about earlier was describing it in world, right? And that I feel is a really, really good option in most cases, where you could, as your character, describe what your character would about the thing that they're trying to show. And then suddenly you don't lose that roleplay time, but you're still able to convey what the thing is, right? You can still say it's a brown cover book. When you open it, it has details about some sort of magical artifact or whatever. You can still do that. It is very possible to do that. And even like by doing so, you can actually kind of have a lot more freedom on how you want to do that, depending on what your character's perspective is. Because then you can kind of inject some of that character mannerisms into the explanation. Like maybe your character is very well known to not be very magically inclined or knowledgeable, so they could just open this book up and say it's a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo about some magic voodoo stuff. And then suddenly it's very clear to the other person, A, this book has detailed magical information in it, and B, this character doesn't understand too much about it. That evidence is something about the character, right?
I can give a really quick example. Note that this won't work in every case, right? Like this certainly doesn't work all the time. But it's kind of a difference between, you walk up to somebody empty-handed and you're like, I brought you some violets, versus you walk up to somebody empty-handed and you're like, you see that in her hand she has some purple flowers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Those two things are a little bit different. In both cases, right? Like both cases require the other person to imagine that the empty hands hold some flowers, right? Both of those cases require that the other person, engage their theater of the mind and like pretend that something that isn't there is there. But in one of those cases, you also have to pretend that the other person wasn't talking, right?
Yep.
Like you also have to pretend that that narration wasn't there. So it's like an extra element that right, that you have to ignore, that you would otherwise not have to ignore.
Isn't it funny?
Um,
Sorry, I really want to say this. Isn't it funny that like we have to pretend the other? This is the strength of the magic circle. We're gonna get to that in a bit, but this is just such a strength, right? That like we have to pretend that outside isn't there, to suspend disbelief, to like maintain what we have inside. So we have to pretend to not pretend, right? Isn't that crazy? I love that.
yeah, I got, huh?
So just to kind of throw
Yeah.
on, go on.
Gosh, it's now it's not always, it's not always that simple, right? Like it's as much as I'd like to, especially if we kind of go over the previous example of like, well, we don't have infinite time, we don't have infinite resources. You didn't add the magic book to your character, and also your character is not very knowledgeable about what's in their hand, and you like go up to the other character and it's like, I don't know, it's like I have like a book and I can't read it.
Mm.
And like you're like trying to explain to the other character, and you're like playing this like really complex game of charades, and the other person has like absolutely no idea what's going on because you're not giving them any information. because your character would not be able to convey that the information that they need to know.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't always work, right?
There's a limit.
But so it's not. It's certainly not as easy as just like, well, don't do it. That's why there's an asterisk. And but there's once again there's going to be the question of like, well, if you have something, right? If you have something like this in your in your roleplay where you feel the need, right? You feel like you need to like break the diegesis. You feel like you need to add this like non-diegetic element. Ask yourself the question, what is, once again, same thing as with the other one, ask yourself the question, what is it that I actually need? What is it that I actually want? Do I really need this thing to be in my roleplay, right? Do I really need to do this now? Can I, not wait until later? And, the answer might be yes. The answer might be, yes, we do, right? That is a perfectly legitimate answer, right? Once again, via roleplay, it's literally impossible for us to make things perfectly 100% diegetic. So that answer may be yes, right? Where you may need to introduce this non-diegetic element.
Mm-hmm.
But, ask yourself that question, right? Ask yourself, do I really need to narrate this? Do I really need to bring this non-diegetic element into the world? Is there a similarly simple thing that I could do that is diegetic that would also convey the same information? And if there is, well, you should pick the option that maximizes diegesis.
I distinctly remember like a decent enough example of like where it was extremely hard or impossible to do it with Rowan and Worlds Apart, where I basically spent like a good 15-20 minutes fumbling around with the radio tower, a little radio thing on top of the harpy tower. And as a, clueless deer man from fantasy world looking at like modern tech, he was like, I don't know what the fuck this is. I don't know where this noise is coming from. I'm just gonna mess around with it, try to figure out what's going on. Things fall apart. He just pours a bunch of like glue onto a thing and hope that it sticks together. And it's like this absolute mess of like fumbled wires and things dangling. And I'm just like, someone from modern world comes up and asks what's going on, and like it's looking at it and like wondering what they see. And I'm like, I can't accurately describe this as the guy who has no idea what the parts are. So I did explain it out of character in that circumstance, and I did it as quickly as possible to minimize that amount of time out. But realizing in that circumstance, I didn't have a very clear way of conveying as the character what actually was going on there, and that again plays into that asterisk of, well, sometimes it really you have to recognize when it's like not very possible or not very doable with the character's perspective, in which case then you gotta like pull out a little bit. And then that's the purpose of this principle, is definitely to find and or think about those moments where you can do it, which is a lot of the time. But if it's not possible, if you do have a strong enough difference in perspective versus like what the character actually can accurately talk about or show, then yeah, there's the exception usually. Another circumstance that I think of that comes into play there is like I want to call this the like walk by explanation, the thing that gets noticed as you walk by somewhere, right? And I like to think that the alternative to this, which the example being, as you walk by here, you smell something horrible. Like maybe a character ended up like playing around the sewers or whatever, and then they smell like absolute garbage. And they come up, and then that player has to somehow convey to others, because they don't have the sense of smell to play off of. They have to somehow portray to characters that they smell awful. And the chosen way to do this, I find, is a lot of people kind of like say, when you pass by, you smell, it smells horrible or something like that. Add stink lines effect to avatars. Oh no. Kurlon's gonna do the thing. So that is one option though, right? Like you can prepare by having either as the world creator a stink lines effect ready because you know there's a sewer and you expect people to kind of dig around in there, or if as the player maybe you expect to do that because you know it's on the map and you know your character would be interested in it, and you just have that at the ready. Player level, that just means that maybe you are the only one that thought of this, and like you're the only person that can do that, which kind of sucks, but it's whatever. The alternative that I like to propose is that there is the attention grabbing of like this person isn't already in a scene, so you're gonna have to kind of grab them and effectively give them a scene detail that they weren't already involved with. So like if I'm walking down the street and there's someone to my right and that person on the right is that person that went to the sewer. Like how if you were the person on the right that just went in there, how do you do this, right? And my thought is like you grab the attention and you still describe the detail in character because it's the same sort of solution, I think, where basically you just add the detail of the attention grabbing part of it, and how to do that within live action role plays. It's very common sense, right? You talk to someone in kind of the, hey, sorry, I smell awful. I know. I had to find something down under. You know how it is. Dropped a little gadget down there. I don't recommend going down there, right? Like it's I don't know how else to explain it other than what we just talked about, right? It is one of those very similar circumstances. You just, oh yeah, like Kurlon says here, just hold your nose. I won't be here long. Just finding ways to portray the information without just saying it, right? Like you notice that this character smells awful versus like, sorry, I know I smell awful. I'm gonna go take a shower. Gonna be up there for like 30 minutes. Don't mind me. What feels better for you being on the receiving end of that? You know, think about it.
I'm going to have a short little thesis here. Because like I also have an example. I had like I think I was playing Lily, my 1 foot tall fairy, right? And like I was sent on like a wild goose chase for some mushrooms that I definitely I would not have found without kind of GM help. But I don't know, I didn't really feel like pinging anybody, so I just like, you know, I'm playing my fairy. I like fly outside of town. I go through the forest. I'm like, you know what? It'd be really funny if I just like bring back like a giant mushroom. I think that would be kind of funny. So I go and do exactly that. I go. I like walk up to somebody else. I'm like, here, I have this I have this giant mushroom, and like trying to explain it to the to other people, kind of like in character, because of course, this mushroom was not actually a giant mushroom. It was just like about maybe like relatively large, but relatively large means about the size that she was, which is relatively small. Uh, you know, but obviously I'm sitting there and like in character, I'm like, oh, I have this like giant mushroom, right? And other characters around me are like taking it super seriously. They're like, yeah, we must investigate immediately. How we must investigate immediately what caused this mushroom to grow so big. And eventually I'm like, okay, this might actually be a problem. I feel like people are like going off and like thinking this is something more than a short bit that I just came up with. And so I break character, explain it, only to then find out that actually my conveyance of what I was going for was perfect, and everybody understood that the thing that I had conveyed, that actually this mushroom is rather small, I'm just kind of playing it up from my character perspective. But then I didn't understand the reverse, right? I didn't like I basically got like did not pick up that they understood because their characters were also saying the thing in the character, right? That like they couldn't tell me that they understood. So I didn't understand that they understood. So you have like multiple layers to this. But I bring up this example just to kind of add another one to the pile and kind of like notice a pattern here, right? I think I think if we like think about kind of like a pattern of narration being non-diegetic. Um oh no, Caroline, no. That's not how anything started because we did get it cleared up. But in any case, I think there's a pattern here, and the pattern is that a lot of the time that people feel the need to narrate and in a non-diegetic fashion, it's usually when things are being done fast and made up on the spot, and also in combat roleplay. But I don't feel like talking about that right now. But when it's not combat roleplay, it's usually when things are being done fast and made up on the spot and introduced on the spot. And I think that's like an interesting thing to think about, right? Because like if you plan something out ahead of time, right, then you have the opportunity to kind of like put it on your avatar, bring it into the world. Once again, you assuming infinite time, infinite resources, right? Without infinite time, infinite resources, you might not be able to. But if you have the time, right, generally you'll be able to make it diegetic. It's when you do it off the cuff that that this tends to happen. And here is my idea here. First of all, this is like a advocacy for planning. Like kind of planning things ahead of time. I think planning and talking to people and like figuring things out is great, but I do recognize this is not always possible, right? Roleplay is improvised, not scripted. Here's the thing, though. We can make those improvised and scripted things, or improvised and not scripted things, more likely to not need you to go out and add something new to the world, right? This feeling of needing to pull things out of thin air, I think, is a symptom. And I think one of the ways that you can help this is by having like a strong thematic core, knowing what you want out of the roleplay, having a strong thematic core that everybody can engage with. The things that you will end up improvising will end up being more along the lines of what already exists in the world, what has already been evidenced. Therefore, raising the likelihood that these improvised events will not need you to add something new off the cuff in the moment.
It would help, certainly, right? Like,
Yeah, it's certainly not a cure-all, right? Like,
yeah.
I'm not saying this is a cure-all. I'm just kind of like attempting to diagnose this as like a symptom of like, why do we feel the need to bring things into the world out of the blue, right? Why do we feel that need? Um, and I think kind of like from my experience in improv, right? Generally the time when you are bringing things in out of the blue is when you're building the base reality together, right? That's when you're kind of like building the world. Um, to me, this feels like a symptom of a world that hasn't been finished being built, and so you want to pull something in because you don't have something to pull in, right? And of course you may not you're never going to be able to represent everything, right? You're never going to be able to represent every single inch, every single aspect of your world, because you don't have infinite time or infinite resources. This is what themes are for, though, is you can kind of direct people's attention to specific parts of the world where here's where we're doing most of our role play. And the parts and also, by having these themes that direct your attention towards specific things, you also direct people's attention away from the parts of the world that you haven't built out. And so making it less likely that you're going to pull something in that hasn't been hasn't been created, hasn't been evidenced already.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just
Go ahead.
I'm agreeing. I'm agreeing. No, I'm just I don't have much to add. It all checks out. It's like this is gonna help directing toward the things that you expect is going to help. That's yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. And once again, this is not to say any of this is bad, right? Like definitely some of my favorite roleplay moments have been those things, right? Have been those things that were figured out off the cuff. Sometimes it is exactly what you need, right? Sometimes the narrative, the narrative satisfaction of having like the perfect thing at the perfect time outweighs kind of the need for immersion, right? Sometimes. But if it's something that's happening constantly and consistently, that people feel the need to kind of introduce things into the world just that aren't actually there, you feel the need to say that, I have these flowers in my hand, because you have nothing else to do, right? You have nothing else to do, nothing else to talk about. Then, maybe that is a sign that you want to kind of direct your players' attention in a specific place, right? If you have those themes, instead of your players kind of guessing and like trying to randomly pull things in based on how they're feeling in the moment, you can have the themes kind of guide people in the same directions, right? You can guide people kind of in the same directions. And that way it's going to be more likely that you can use the things that you already have rather than needing to pull something in that you don't have.
Yeah.
And just from like making your things, right, making the things that you do add, right, making the diegetic elements that you do add into your game, making them work more, right? If you can use things more than once, that's fantastic, because that will first of all, it's possible that it will be less work for your dev team. Second of all, if you don't care about less work for your dev team, then instead you can have your dev team also do something else, right? In addition to, right, you can then do more things, right? If you free up that time.
Yeah.
So it's like either less work or an opportunity for more things to be done with the same amount of work.
That sounds like benefits to me.
Yeah. All right, now I'm sorry. I've been speaking for a while. Do you mind if I go on another tangent? I have another one.
Go for it.
Real quick.
Do it.
All right, because I guess we've been talking about like kind of removing things from, or sorry, not removing things. We've been talking about non-diegetic things in the game world. And I mentioned at the very beginning, there's like a huge asterisk in the kind of here in front of maximize diegesis of you maximize diegesis means you make things diegetic when possible. I think this is like a really important point. Like the when possible in this context of adding non-diegetic things to your world, really important. I want to talk a bit about safety mechanics. So, I will say that if you can add your safety mechanics in a way that it is diegetic and in world, by all means do so. But I would say that safety mechanics are one of those things where if you can't, right, if you have your non-diegetic safety mechanic, it's more important. It's more important to have your safety mechanic. If it needs to be non-diegetic to function properly, to work well, make your safety mechanics non-diegetic. It's okay, right? This is one of those things where it's okay, right? It's more important to have those than to not. And I guess the little bit of Now, of course, if you find a way to make your safety mechanic diegetic, fantastic, beautiful, great. Make sure it works. To avoid the aforementioned problem of like it needs to be really clear, right? Whatever it is, it needs to be really clear both in and out of character if you're going down that route. But I did want to do like at least a little bit of commentary, right? Like back from episode 3 here, we were doing a bit of like criticism on kind of the existing roleplay community with like the lack of safety mechanics as being essential. I'm going to add another point here to that because I think one of the biggest like kind of things that I've heard kind of or one of the arguments or kind of like one of the things that I've heard kind of against safety mechanics is the fact that if they can potentially be non-diegetic and immersion breaking. I've kind of certainly had people kind of being uncomfortable using safety mechanics because they feel like they're letting their scene partners down, right? It feels like you're letting your scene partners down. This is more of like a personal feeling. And I want to contrast that a little bit with the huge prevalence of narration for things like I have purple flowers in my hand. Right? That's super prevalent. I don't know. Like I've been in so many roleplays. I don't think I've been in a roleplay where I haven't seen people like narrating like at least once per session. Maybe not everybody, but like I've seen it around me, right? I've seen it happen in my vicinity, right? And I am feeling uncomfortable is certainly, I think, a lot more important than I have purple flowers in my hands, right? Or like she's holding flowers in her hands or whatever, right? So just food for thought. Consider that the next time if you as a player feel uncomfortable, feel like you're letting down your fellow players by like using your safety mechanics that are going to break the scene, just consider how prevalent narration is for things that like in the grand scheme of things, I will say it, don't really matter, and just consider that the next time you feel like you can't add narration.
I'm not gonna lie, I have never juxtaposed those two, and that has like made my eyes widen because I never really thought about that. I never thought like, wait a minute, like the exact same at the same time you can have this discomfort around like the need to ensure that people are like actually doing all right versus like this total acceptance of I have purple flowers in my hand.
Well, okay, it's certainly not. It's certainly not. I'm not going to pretend like it's acceptance, right? Like it's generally, like I think it is generally looked down upon, right? I think like narration, at least in the spaces that I've been in, it is generally like people are like, don't do it,
Ish.
but it still happens. It still happens, and it happens a lot.
It
Oh
is
boy, does it
the.
happen a lot?
I mean, having been in many spaces that actually do it, like it's not. I don't even think it's generally looked down upon. I think it's very. It's even harder to actually look down upon it in certain circumstances. Like we kind of have been more recently in spaces that have like pushed away from that, and we hang around people that generally push away from it, so that like kind of puts us in this sort of bias.
Mm-hmm.
But having been in all sides, like I'm curious, like how have you found the player base of Gang RP to be very anti narration? Because I imagine it happened a lot there.
In Gang RP, there was certainly an idea that we should narrate less.
Okay.
It still happened.
Yeah.
It didn't matter that there was this idea that we should narrate less. It definitely still happened. So
Right.
that was my experience there. Now I know there are lots of spaces where it's like not looked down upon at all, but like I guess that's been my experience, right? My experience is that people have been kind of coming around to the idea that maybe we shouldn't do explain RP, right? I was
Right.
calling it talk RP. The term was explain RP, and
Mhm.
plain RP was being used in a negative sense. But yeah, no, I mean, regardless of whether or not people think that it should or should not exist, I see it a lot, and so like it exists. So like if it's okay for the explain RP to exist, then it's absolutely 100% okay for the safety mechanic for like explaining that like you need help or you're uncomfortable or whatever. Like that's absolutely 100% okay.
Yeah.
And honestly, that would be absolutely 100% okay anyway. I don't mean to like do that make that comparison of like, oh, if it's not okay to do the explain RP, then it's also not okay to have the safety mechanics. No,
Right.
the safety mechanics are just absolutely okay. It's just like considering the space that we're in, right? I'm more so like reaching out. I want to kind of like reach out to some people that I've certainly spoken to some people who have expressed kind of discomfort in expressing their own discomfort, and like just break character. People do it all the time. People do it all the time for things that are significantly less important.
Yeah. I
And yeah,
I 1000% agree. It's that juxtaposition is going to play in my head for a while now. That purple flowers, it's going to be in my head. Okay, so that's a very important point. Uh, so what I want to do here is transition to an entirely different point that also plays very heavily into this like in and out of character sort of distinction we're really putting here. Uh, and now we're getting to that term we discussed a couple times before. Um, so,
mm-hmm.
how do we determine whether we are in or out of character? Or what spaces do we know for a fact that kind of that exists between this sort of like separation that we want to actually significantly draw between the in and the out, and that's where we get to the magic circle. All right,
Yeah,
that's that fun term.
yeah. There's I suppose I was about to say really easy. I don't think it's a really easy answer, but there's definitely a clear answer to this because hey, we're role playing, and part of role play is that we make this agreement with each other ahead of time that we're going to be playing pretend. There's some rules, right? There are rules and boundaries that we draw in between what is real and what is part of the game, and that boundary, right? The boundary between the real and the imaginary is called the magic circle. So to answer the question of, well, how do we determine like what is and isn't, what is and isn't in the boundary of like being diegetic? The answer is we agree upon that, preferably beforehand, right? Preferably before the role play begins. Um,
Yes, and this magic circle is effectively where we define all those rules and is the boundary, right? This is exactly the line that we draw, that we say when you cross it, you are in character, and when you cross again, you're out of character. And again, it's hard to say it's that simple, but at a conceptual level, it really is, right? Like so for example, uh,
if
this
you agree, if you agree that space clowns are part of your world, then the space clowns are diegetic.
yes, exactly, and you know for a
Depends
fact
on, yeah.
And you know for a fact that when you click that button in your spawn room and you get positioned within this room, within the world where you have agreed that space clowns are real, then you know it is normal for space clowns to be walking around because they are real. Right?
I don't know. That's the first thing that came to mind. I don't know why that's the first thing that came to mind, but
Look, we're gonna make a space clown RP now. It's inevitable.
this is the
Killer
I don't know.
clowns or
It's like Space Station 13 here. Just like
Yeah, Curlon, I don't think they have to be killer clowns. They just have to be space clowns, right? Why can't clowns have a decent uh, why can't they have a decent job? Why do they have to be killers all the time? What's with that? Why are clowns always so murderously portrayed? Just have like a decent job.
Just want, yeah, just nice, goofy guy.
Yeah. He just wears too much makeup and you know, it's just a profession. Anyways, so this what I described is physical separation, right? The physical boundary, the tangible boundary is clear. The magic circle is, in the very practical sense, a very tangible boundary. In that, for us, we already do this without thinking about it. In that most role plays tend to have a very clear out of character area, which is outside of the magic circle, and then a spawn or a teleporter or something similar that takes you into the world that is a very different, distinct area that we know is in character and in the magic circle. But that boundary, that like specific boundary that requires distinctly, deliberately entering to go into this space is like effectively the most crucial thing to this, because you do not want that line to be blurred of the magic circle. You want it to be as clear as possible, and you want crossing in and out of it to be as deliberate as possible, because then you know what's in and what's out. I'm reading what Carlon said here. Spend all that time learning to be a clown, the makeup, the costumes, and then deal with people for a couple days who don't get your humor and tell me you won't go homicidal. Okay, hang on. That's a lot. Look, if someone doesn't get my joke, I say, understandable, have a nice day, and then... Or I just triple down, you know? There's no in between. Can't say I've gotten the homicidal urges yet, though. Silent, any thoughts? don't let it go silent on that.
I'll stay out of this one.
Okay.
I guess not my.
How about the magic circle, huh?
Yeah. Okay. Gosh. Yeah. I mean, I think I think that the first important like thing to realize here, right, is that, you know, from the way that we've kind of like defined this, right, the magic circle is the division between the game world and everything outside, right? And because it is a kind of an implicit agreement, or rather sometimes even an explicit agreement on everyone's behalf, right? Everyone who's in the role play. I think the first thing that's really important to recognize is that the magic circle, right, the place where you draw your boundary, is entirely arbitrary. You get to choose where it is. There is nothing, right? It's this is a designable element of your game. In other words, it's, I think, the first kind of like realization.
Yeah. I think that's like an interesting thing to think about too, right? Because we talked about 360 lives before, and that's a really good example of like changing where you define the magic circle, because you would make your magic circle quite a bit bigger in your 360 LARP because you are scoping in a lot more things. Whereas if you have a more contained experience and you have a time frame, then you are shrinking the magic circle to enclose very specific things to accomplish that. And there's different dimensions to this, right? Time is one dimension. Topics, different concerns about settings, right? There's a lot to think about there, and especially the Magic Circle kind of grants us the opportunity to kind of like Dylan said, define those rules about the space, about the social contract that we enter when role playing. That like this is the place to specify these things. This is the place to specify what the space actually means and what is what how we conduct ourselves as players. Because entering within that means we either implicitly or explicitly accept those agreements, which means that we are playing by those rules and we are suspending reality for those rules to some extent. And so the degree to which we do that is we have the ability to control how much we suspend and how many rules that we want to put in, how much we want to define about that agreement, because that's where it happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I wanted to bring this up just a little bit because I was kind of like making the argument earlier in kind of like some of my arguments earlier kind of like hinged on the fact on like kind of assuming that you have kind of like choice behind like what is diegetic and what is not, and I kind of like skimmed over it at the time. But like this is why it is your choice, because what is diegetic and what is not is literally what you agree upon before you start the roleplay, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're playing pretend. There is no like the rules don't exist except in the minds of the people coming together to roleplay, right? The rules don't exist except in that agreement. So you get to choose what that agreement is going to be. So if and I guess this is another kind of like pro planning thing. If you're having trouble including something into the diegesis, right? Like if you're kind of like having trouble including something into your game, you can kind of like draw that line how you see fit, right? You can if you're like, okay, well actually this isn't a good fit for my game, you can just be like, okay, well this isn't in the world, right? Or you might find it really important and then you're like, okay, well actually it is in the world, right? You get to choose what is and isn't in the world. So essentially you get to make it harder or easier for yourself to represent things in your roleplay, depending on how ambitious or experimentative you want to be.
I was sorry. I actually searched up the Loric LARP definition on the wiki, and
Yeah.
found some very interesting points on the bottom that are examples of the magic circle outside of LARP that we already kind of consider. And I'll expand the first example to literally any sport, right? Anytime you enter an area that is specifically designated for a sport to happen, and it is happening, life plays by different rules, right? When you're on a football field while a football game is happening, you're expected to be playing in that game, right? If you are just walking around as if you were walking on a sidewalk on a football field while a game's happening, you're probably going to get taken off and talked to, right? Because
people will probably be quite angry that you're on this thing and you're like,
yeah, because normally to enter that field, you agree to some set of rules, and one of those rules is that you're not casually walking while the game's going, because there's a designated amount of people that are supposed to be on at very specific amounts of time and at very specific points during the game, and there's all these other kind of considerations there. But it's something that we haven't like. It's not thought of as a magic circle, because we just implicitly understand that this is the place where this game happens, and there are rules if you want to be on that field, that you're probably either playing that game or you're involved enough to understand maybe I shouldn't be on this field right now. Like if I'm a coach, I probably shouldn't be running on to go tell my players things, but I'm not supposed to be on there.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, people from the audience, if they jump down on the field, that's a problem. They get removed. But
I'm now having fun imagining the flip side, which is like, you know, you go into work, you set up a net and like start kicking a ball into the net, and like probably shouldn't be surprised that like not everybody is like cheering
yeah,
for you, right?
yeah. You also
Because
shouldn't be surprised if your boss walks up to you and asks what the hell you're doing, because what's going on? Why are you kicking a ball? This is a bit dangerous inside this enclosed work environment. That's another magic circle, by the way. I don't know if you guys have realized that. That's it's a bit of a lighter one, but businesses have to work a certain way, and how you conduct yourself at work is probably very different from how you conduct yourself at home. Right? Home is another one. Right? These are very like very light but still definitive magic circles to some degree. Uh, Role play, we effectively think as one of the most hardline ones because we are literally thinking of a different reality.
so what you're saying, Solace, is that we live in a society.
No one cared who I was until I put on a mask or something like that. Yeah. We live in a society. Totally. We live amongst a massive Venn diagram of magic circles. That's where we live. And just think about that one day when you're like, heading to your friend's place or going to work or whatever. Just think about like entering that circle and like what that means.
Social responsibilities and rituals.
Yeah. Which is rituals are like, according to this same page, the exact same origin of the concept. It's ritual magic. Fun fact. But yeah, it's a interesting thing to think about.
In roleplay, unlike in broader society, I suppose, society can be, I suppose, a bit more, a bit harder to change. But role plays, we design them, right? We get to choose. We get to choose, lots and lots and lots of details, and as a result, when you're doing a role play, you're not limited by existing like cultural norms or like societal norms, right? You get to choose what you want to be your magic circle, and as such, right, if you're ever feeling kind of like trapped, like, oh, I need to add this, right, I need to bring this element into my role play, I need it, um that this was kind of like the crux of my argument earlier of like, well, actually you don't, and this is why you don't, right? The reason you don't, the reason you get to choose what to add and what to not add is because you have control, uh, like as the people who are, organizing, and as the people who are participating in the role play, you get to choose what that agreement is, right? You get to choose what the magic circle is.
You know what's crazy?
Yeah.
I have once again forayed over to search for more informative articles. Found another one from Noric LARP that also talks about transparency and communication and playing to lift, right under talking about the magic circle.
It's almost like all this stuff is related. Wow.
That's a pretty wild idea. I think I might be on the fringe, thinking that everything's related. Fringe thinking, kind of crazy.
I'm sorry. I do tend to be a little bit crazy sometimes.
It's all right. It's okay to be radical. No, but God, everything's just it's all so interconnected. Next. Okay, so what else to talk about with the magic circle? More ways to. I mean, like we could kind of we can kind of understand this in the opposite sense too, of like instead of just the out going in, for like the inward direction, think about the outward direction as well, right? Like this is certainly a determination that can help us address things like bleed, right? Because we can, by at least thinking of the magic circle, we are conceptualizing and understanding that bleed happens, and we know how it happens because we know what the distinction is and we know where the rules are. When those lines are blurred, it becomes a lot more difficult. This I would like to.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Being clear, right? In this case, maximizing the diegesis of your roleplay in this context, right? I think like making sure that your roleplay elements are diegetic. Another way to interpret that, I think, is I think what you're getting at is being really clear on what is and isn't diegetic will help people only do the things that are diegetic. And when somebody goes and does something that's not diegetic, right, it becomes very clear that it's not diegetic, right? Having a very clear distinction between those two things will absolutely help with things like bleed, because bleed is what happens when when those things blur. And you're never going to eliminate it, right? Like you're never going to eliminate bleed, but making it clear when something is an in-world in-game action versus when something is a out-of-game action um, is a form in this case of maximizing diegesis, because then the things that aren't diegetic aren't part of the role play. If you allow the things that aren't diegetic to be part of your role play, right? That or rather, if you allow things that are going to kind of like break immersion to like blur the lines and like blend with your role play, then that will not only lower immersion and make things less diegetic, but it will also make things more confusing and will kind of add to that kind of cognitive dissonance that leads to bleed. Never going to eliminate it, right? It's impossible, because at the end of the day we are ourselves. That's the thing that the not even the 360 larps can eliminate, right? Is that you are a person and not the character that you're portraying.
Mm-hmm.
But so you're never going to 100% eliminate that fuzziness. But in my opinion, the sharper the line, the more clear it is what is and isn't inside your roleplay, the better, right? And the more clear, less confusing, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Like the first thing that comes to mind for me on like the opposite end is like the kind of chips slash lobby style roleplay that used to happen a lot like 5-ish plus years ago, right? Which it would basically just be like the friends group coming together, acting like they are different people but using their same names. And it's like, they've kind of as friends entered these sort of like agreements with each other implicitly of like knowing when it's in roleplay and being able to kind of talk things out and have a good time. In a general sense, that's like A, not really setting up too much of that magic circle or diegesis, and B, like it can be very dangerous in any other circumstance because you are really not defining what's in versus out. And especially when you are even kind of just not defining too much of a difference between like the names, even like if you're just like carrying the names in, it's basically just like you are playing yourself but like in a different reality. Then it's like, well, as a person or as a character, what's happening here? uh and the answer to the question, which in that circumstance I don't think was really like asked much, which is kind of like part of the intention there. I think like just kind of suspending disbelief and saying it's all in character, we're good, and it working out was like fortunate for sure. In a general sense, how do you answer that question? This is something that we have to consider quite a bit, even if we have this very clear, distinct roleplay world. where we're not just hanging out, but we're following plots and we're playing characters with different beings, different names, thought spaces, intentions, all of that kind of stuff. And even then, there's still that consideration of like, but is this in character? Like,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how much we have really pushed in that difference, there is still kind of the human need to understand what's happening in a given situation, especially for those of us with anxiety. Like I tend to juggle that thought quite a bit, being a more anxious person. That if I feel like something is off, then I have that anxious thought of like, well, is it me? Like, what's going on here? And having that sort of clear distinction still needs to be kind of the fundamental defining line for that magic circle, because even with all of that, the thought still being there means there are still questions left to be answered. In which case, that just means the rules, whatever upholds that magic circle, definitely has some room to be stronger. And just knowing that that consideration is still around just kind of informs us that like this is something that's still important, and it helps kind of address those sorts of worries that we might have when it comes to questions or concerns or any sort of understandings we have about Blade, whether it's ourselves or the people we're working with.
Mm-hmm. Suppose as a quick reminder, if anybody has like any questions of any sort, at least tangentially related to the topic, you may ask at any time. I will continue though in the meantime. Yeah, and yeah, I think you're right. I do think speaking of like friend groups and whatnot, I think as always, I think friend groups can get away with a bit more than, or like close knit friend groups can get away with a bit more than literally anybody else, for the simple reason of close knit friend groups tend to talk with each other and check in on each other, quite often, at least in my experience. Of course, maybe this isn't true universally, and if your friend group doesn't check in on each other when doing these things, then maybe you still need to think about like clearly defining, like much more explicitly defining your boundaries, than if you do engage in the regular checking in, because of course the regular checking in is basically like that's when you do the things like defining your boundaries. It's just a bit less structured.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a thing. Like whenever you're looking at like friend group role plays, I tend to judge those by maybe a little bit different standard. Um, for that reason, simply because friend groups tend to on average do the things that that are necessary, that anybody who's not in a close knit friend group will kind of have to substitute by making it structured.
Right. That's just on the other end the thing that comes with working with people that aren't necessarily your friends or even remotely acquainted to you, that you do need that sort of strong foundational set of uh, rules to that social contract, because you got to make sure you're at least close to on the same page with someone else if you don't know or have any established trust with them before getting into there. That being said, usually better to have the opportunity to in some way build that sort of professional trust, if you will, as fellow role players, fellow actors in the medium. That like if you have like a couple of workshops or something before starting a role play, or like even just have the shared space for a bit, like send in a voice call, or just like have some like active text channels or something to just like chill with them for a bit, understand how they think, and that's a good boon too. That's kind of why I feel like it's generally extremely important to have a roleplay space also be a community space, and that's actually something I've heard a lot of back and forth on from a lot of different people on like whether role plays need to be community spaces. I generally think they do. I generally think that's like extremely necessary because we don't really have many other ways for role plays to facilitate people building trust. We don't necessarily meet very often with each other besides like the actual sessions themselves, depending on the space. Like some spaces, people generally only enter that space because there's so much happening within it. Role plays in particular for VR tend to have a very high time commitment. So if people are in multiple role plays, that means they're probably not doing much outside of those role plays. And if they are only in one space that there's a lot going on, then like it's probably the only one that they're in. There's probably not much else that they have involved with, which means that if they do kind of branch out, it's likely to a different group, and that means they don't really have the specific time to get involved with a lot of stuff outside the actual session. So like what we do then, I feel like the best answer for that is having that sort of larger community around the roleplay to help facilitate people talking to each other. It's just one of those things where people gauge each other's intentions and what they're excited for, and that kind of helps build that ambient trust of like I know at the very least what these people are interested in, and because that's similar to what I'm interested in, it's a lot easier for me as that player to explore those things with everyone else.
Mm-hmm. I think this is actually probably more true in VR roleplay than in kind of like other roleplay spaces, because like I don't know, if you go to like your local LARP or your local game store to roleplay, right? You're going to at least like there's a higher likelihood that you kind of share something in common with the people there. If it's like local, there's a higher likelihood that you have kind of like at least something in common, namely a shared culture, right?
Sure, yeah.
It's kind of like easier to have that shared culture. Um, and like that's kind of like what can turn something into community. Here in online VR land, we have a incredibly multicultural space, with people all around the world and like everywhere, and like two people online are probably going to have like generally like two random people online are probably going to have like in general like less in common, I suppose, aside from the fact that maybe maybe we tend to in the VR roleplay we tend to fall on the uh, more introverted end usually,
Mm-hmm.
but as far as like culture goes, right? Like it's very unlikely that you're going to be in a space that if you're just entering into a role play, it's very unlikely that role play you're going to share the culture of that role play, because it's going to just be people from all over the world, and you're going to have a culture that's necessarily unique to that specific role play and has nothing to do with where you're from or any other characteristic that you might be bringing. um, Probably, right? Most of the time, right? You might have some role plays that are you know online but still feature majority like people from somewhere, but unlikely, right?
Mm.
um, and so like I think like having it be a community space kind of helps with that, right? You get to know the people that you're role playing with, because you're going to need to do extra work to build those shared kind of those shared connections, right? Going to need to do more work because you have less in common.
Right. I would say at least I would argue that the at least the internet culture on its own is generally pretty strong. I think that's like what I found to be a really strong basis on how people kind of find common ground with each other. I
Sure, there are definitely multiple internet cultures though.
it's
Like,
true, yeah. I mean, there's
yeah.
there's at least enough shared that I find that a lot of people tend to relate to each other very easily on, like talking about uh, new game releases or something, right? Like that seems to be something that people very easily latch onto, versus like talking about sports, right? That is a topic I never hear about in any of the VCs that I go into around any role play, because it's just not something that people tend to be very interested in if they're more interested in things that happen around the internet, right? It's just one of those things.
This is true. I heard that the Olympics was starting only after it started.
Yeah, I just learned about that today, if I'm going to be honest. Actually, no, yesterday. Sorry, yesterday, because my sister texted me asking me a question about fencing because I fenced for 1 year in college, and she's like, she just wanted to know, and I was like, yeah, Olympic fencing is not like low level fencing. Low level, we do a lot of back and forth, advance and retreats. Olympic fencing, they plan out 2 seconds of engagements, and then they just go in, and it becomes this like massive planned out thing that like unfortunately even the electric signals are not enough to determine who gets the point because there's actually like determinations about who's advancing, who's retreating, and what that means in the rules, and it's they still need judges, and it's wild. It's very wild.
Mhm.
Crazy sport. But
I know. I'm just going to nod and be like, uh huh, uh huh.
if y'all ever get a chance to watch a professional Olympic level fencing match, like just watch it and then watch it in slow mo. You'll see what I mean. It is so intricate in like such contained short amount of time. So short amounts of time. There we go. I can speak. It's very strange having fence and then seeing how fast it actually is. Just like, you can get your back and forth for like a minute and a half, or you can just smash that all into a second and a half. Quite wild.
Hmm.
Judge's ability is to observe and then call back what happens step by step with accurate terminology. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes it is as simple as your foot lands at a certain time, or the blades connect at a certain point. Very wild. Anyways, we're not talking about fencing. What more? What more do we have on the magic circle? I feel like we covered a lot.
Yeah, I think that's really I don't know. I think that's all I have to say about it.
Sure. We have anything else to go over? I feel like we
Uh,
got it all.
I think we're pretty good. So in other words, this is the perhaps the last chance to ask questions as we wrap up here.
Yeah.
I'll try to like maybe we can summarize because we did kind of take a meandering path through these topics today.
Mhm.
I'll try to like kind of summarize it for all for today, right? Because I think like the name here, the name of this specific principle of Couchform is maybe like a bit simpler than the principle itself is. Like it's the principle is I think a bit more nuanced than the title, right? Maximize diegesis, right? What does that mean? Right, diegesis is any something is diegetic if it is part of the game world, right? And when we say we want to maximize it, right, that doesn't mean that we just make everything part of the game world, right? What that means is we clearly define our magic circle, right? We clearly kind of plan out and discuss and agree on what is and isn't within the game world as part of like planning our role play. Then once we do that, we want to do that in a way where the things that are diegetic, right, the things that we are bringing into our world, kind of support the themes of our role play, right? We as cool as VR is with like we can bring anything that we want into the game world basically. Like any type of story that we want to tell, we could do it. But we don't have infinite time or resources, so we still have to make choices, right? We can't just have everything in our game. We have to decide what is the most important and kind of like go down a list and how much we end up with is going to depend on how many resources we have. So you have an idea of what is and isn't in your game, and then what it means to maximize diegesis is that anything that you can, right? Anything that is part of your roleplay that you can make part of the game world rather than being explicitly outside the game world, you should. Right? If it's in your roleplay and you can make it part of your game world and you can make it make sense within the story of your game, you should do that. There are some exceptions where it may be impossible, right? There are some exceptions where, like, especially around, like, safety mechanics, where, like, you might have a certain safety mechanic that will work better if, especially, like, having the safety net of just going cards down is like that's pretty huge, and I personally don't think, like, if you can avoid it, you probably shouldn't take that away. It's a pretty big benefit. Mind you, I'm actually kind of nervous. I want to I'm sorry. I'm like trying to wrap up here, but I just thought of something because I'm exploring interactive theater here, and one of the biggest differences I think between roleplay and interactive theater is, interactive theater, you have actors, and it's explicitly, you never want to drop character for any reason. And I'm actually kind of nervous about that. I'm going to have to, like, think about, like, we're going to have to be really careful and like really put in that extra effort to bring all of our safety mechanics into the world. So I'm like thinking of ways to do that. That's gonna be a nice challenge, but it's gonna be like some extra thought that's necessary for the interactive theater. Of We'll actually need to have all of our safety mechanics in world, and we won't be able to rely on simply going cards down. Which is kind of like interesting to think about. Anyway, sorry, I got I tangented myself there. But yeah, anything that you can, right? Anything that you're adding to the game world, if you can bring it into the world of your game, you should.
Yeah, that's a good summary. That covers all of it. Oh yeah. Um. All right. I suppose with that being said, barring any potential questions coming in about any of these topics, I'm gonna go ahead and start wrapping up. So, this podcast talks about Couchform, the school of thought, where we build around themes with a note on deliberate design and playing to lift to kind of enhance some of those themes, along with some other principles that we have discussed up to this point and will discuss later. I'm going to go ahead and type it in the chat there. The core principles themselves are represented in that Google Doc link, and the conversation continues over in the Mirai Discord server, which we are currently in a stage channel in, and it also houses the Couchform principles along with any other resources and mints of knowledge that we publish alongside that. And yeah, we run this podcast every Sunday whenever we can, and we'll be covering all of the 12. I'm saying that a question mark right now. 12.
It is 12.
All the 12 principles by the end of this podcast. We are currently 7 in, and yeah, I haven't realized we passed the halfway point. That's kind of wild.
Yeah, more than halfway.
That is wild. We're getting there. We're getting, and it doesn't ramp down. These last ones are pretty big too. Oh my god, they're big.
Mm-hmm.
Reality Subjective is going to be a huge one, and that's number 10. Okay, so that being said, let's go ahead and actually, And do we have anything else to shout out here in our wrap up?
I
You have anything?
don't think I have anything in particular.
Okay. I will very
not today. Not today. Maybe another time.
Mm-hmm. I will very briefly shout out that I am currently working on my own roleplay, which is called Legacy, and at some point when I finally start getting some headway on the world creation here, that I will actually start opening up the server for applications for people to apply to be a part of it. I have some really big plans for that, but I have been wanting to evidence some of this ideology in actual practice, and hoping that it works out well, so we can put it in a real time environment rather than just talking about it. It'd be fun.
You know, Curlon actually has something to shout out here. Thank you for reminding. I will.
No.
Vampire the Masquerade.
Oh my god. Reset the counter. Curlon, this is your fault. I just want you to know that. He says this podcast has gone 0 streams without mentioning VTM. Man, I could have just
too slow.
I could have pressed the stop streaming button and just avoided it completely, but look where we are. All right.
Too slow.
Curlon's too fast for me. All right. That's it. Unless we got anything else, I'm going to go ahead and end the podcast.
Bye.
All right. Take care, everyone. We'll see you guys next week, where we're going to talk about roleplay mechanics and game mechanics, and the principle itself being named no game mechanics. Should give you an idea of the direction we're leading there. Look forward to that. All right. We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.